Okay, this is the next installment of our class, What's in a Name? A Study About God. For the past several weeks, we've been looking at a specific verse in Exodus, and this is a continuation of looking at that verse. Specifically today, we're going to look at the phrase slow to anger, and at least start to answer the question, why does God get angry? The verse we've been looking at in Exodus is here on the screen. The part of the verse that we've been looking at specifically is highlighted in yellow. And just as a reminder, where this verse occurs in the narrative of the story is that the Israelites have left Egypt. Moses has gone up to receive the Ten Commandments. People have been told about the Ten Commandments. Down at the bottom of the mountain, they have rebelled by building a golden calf. God has decided to relent from punishing the people the way he wanted to punish them. And after all those series of events, God reveals to Moses who he is specifically with these words: the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and the fourth generation. The verse describes compassion, graciousness, love, and faithfulness. And those are all attributes that I think we like to have with a God that we worship and a God that we call our Father, just like we would like to have those characteristics in a friend or a family member. However, in the middle of those phrases, there's a phrase slow to anger, and then the entire paragraph is balanced with this phrase at the end, yet he punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents, the third and fourth generation. It obviously puts a challenge on reading this verse, at least to us, may spin it in a non-positive light. And I think that this tension is part of the mystery and part of the challenge of understanding God. But researching and discovering and digging into that is part of the joy of getting to know God as well. The obvious question that arises, at least for me, when reading this is, I have these characteristics of love and faithfulness, compassion and mercy. But then I have this phrase of anger and punishment. So the question I'm left with is, which one of those wins? Does one always win over the other? When does anger trump the compassion? The answer to this question is part of what we're working through in this class. However, the broader question we are working with as we go through this entire series is, who is God and how should I, or how can I, reflect his image? 2 weeks ago, we started looking at this verse specifically by dissecting a little more closely the first phrase in that paragraph, compassion. And what we did is we traced back the Hebrew word compassion back to its root word, which is shared with the root word for the Hebrew word womb. And the thing we drove to there is that comparing compassion and womb is helpful in understanding what compassion is, and that compassion is, first of all, something that is a feeling or an emotion that is deep in the core of your body, close to where a womb would be at. And second is, it's a connection that a mother has with her baby. Oftentimes in Scripture, God is compared to a loving mother, a nursing mother. And the same idea of a mom, how she treats her baby, is similar to this feeling of compassion that God shares for us. However, compassion is not just a feeling. Compassion is more than a feeling. Recapping from 2 weeks ago, we said compassion is a deep emotional feeling that spurs somebody to action. You can't be compassionate and sit on the couch and think about what you could do. Compassion drives you to do something. The second word we looked at, and this is just last week, was gracious or graciousness. And the idea we brought up with graciousness is that the word graciousness can be thought of as finding favor or seeing favor in somebody or someone. In fact, in the Old Testament, oftentimes when we see the word favor used, it is actually the same Hebrew root word or phrase as the word graciousness in the Hebrew Bible. An example of when someone finds favor in the Old Testament, or when someone finds graciousness in the Old Testament, is when Esther approaches the king. Esther has spent a lot of time becoming beautiful for the king, so that she can approach him and he will accept her approach. When the king sees her beauty, she finds favor in his eyes and he allows her to approach his throne. In the case of the king, the appearance of Esther is what drives him to find favor with her. However, in the Old Testament, we see oftentimes that God goes a step farther and he finds favor in people, not because of who they are, but more because of who he is and what he sees in them. These two phrases, compassion and graciousness, or gracious, are couples in the Old Testament. And I think this is intentional, and it's a good way to see God, is that compassion and graciousness are, as some people describe, different sides of the same coin. One way to look at it is that it's God's graciousness that allows him to see us in favor, but it's his compassion that drives him to see us in favor, even though we have messed up so poorly. The next thing we talked about is, and this is the crux of the whole class, is that the reason we're looking at this stuff is not just academic, but when we go into the New Testament, we have instructions that we ourselves are to reflect these specific character traits of God. And so we're told to be compassionate and merciful. And what we're also told is that the reason we're able to do these very things is because God first showed us compassion and God first showed us mercy. And so it seems that the way to best get to a point where you can show these characteristics is understanding completely and fully what God himself has done for you. Okay, but that's enough of the recap from last few weeks. This week, we're going to talk about the phrase slow to anger. Unlike the previous character traits, compassion and graciousness, it's not maybe as easy to see this in a positive light as these other words. However, if you look at it, it's not saying that God is angry, but it is saying that when he does become angry, it takes a long time for him to get there, which is consistent with the words we saw earlier, compassion and graciousness. I think one thing for us to deal with, at least me individually, is that we've all had negative encounters with anger. And because we've had negative encounters with anger, sometimes we hold this word personally with a lot of baggage associated with it. For example, I recall as a personal experience, a boss I had when I first started working, that he seemed to find enjoyment in becoming angry and seeing people cower because of his reaction to them. So stories like this, and people on the phone or on the Zoom call, if we were in person, we could share those experiences and how those things have tainted our view of this word anger. But these reasons like this do leave us the bad taste in our mouth when we see this word. Or perhaps we have a hard time settling with the fact that a God who gets angry with us is also a God of compassion. In the Old Testament, there are several stories where God seems to act overly aggressively with people. And so how do you settle that anger of God, or that supposed anger of God, with this idea that he is both compassionate and merciful? Some of these questions are questions for you to wrestle with, if they are questions you have at all. This class probably won't answer all of those to your satisfaction. However, we're going to try to drive at some of the roots to those questions. Before we go any further, though, I think it's important to paint an understanding of what is anger. A few things about anger that cross my mind, at least. Number one, we as individuals, or maybe I should clarify that, me as an individual, I become most angry with the people that I love most. So my worst anger is saved for the people who are closest to me in my life. On the very personal note, my fuse is much shorter once I get home from work than while I'm at work. Number two, related to number one, anger is a very personal and emotional reaction. I think it signals a connection deeper than the surface. So when we express anger, there's something that's going on behind the scenes that has driven us to the point of showing that anger. This should not be confused with a very irritable or hot-headed person. I explained the person I encountered at work in the past. I think there are people who are just angry people, but all of us show anger at times or get angry at times. And when we have that emotion or that reaction, something personal, very personal or close to us has been upset. If we move back to the scripture, there are a handful of questions specifically that I think are worthwhile looking through as we try to chase down this characteristic of God that relates to anger. And the first is, what about this phrase at the end of that paragraph from Exodus 34? God punishes the children and their children. What actually does that mean? Does God hold grudges? Does God present curses on families that last generations and generations? Number two, when does God get angry, or what makes him angry? If you're not to compare God to this boss I had several years ago, but when you're dealing with someone like my boss, you want to make sure you know what drives him to get angry. Again, not comparing God to the individual, but it's still a good question to ask. What are the things that make God angry? And then finally, when God does get angry, what exactly does he do? To answer the first question, we'll start by looking at the revealing of the Ten Commandments to Moses. It's actually in the Ten Commandments back in Genesis. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say Genesis 20. It's a mistake. Sorry about that. Back in the Exodus account of God giving out the Ten Commandments is the first time we see this phrase highlighted in yellow at the bottom of the screen. And where it makes an appearance in the story, I think is very important. So where it makes an appearance in the story is that God gives the first two of the Ten Commandments. There shall be no God before me, and you shall not make for yourself a divine image. And then the phrase is given, your God is a jealous God. And then we go into this sentence, punishing the guilt of the parents on the children on the third and fourth generations for those hating me, and showing loyal love to thousands of generations of those loving me and of those keeping my commandments. The first conclusion we can draw from reading this specific account of when this sentence or phrase is used is that it seems to be connected to either following or not following these first two commandments. It's inserted in the story in a specific location in the text, and that location must have a purpose behind it. So these two things, going back to our definition of anger, seem to, and it makes sense, have a very personal place for the God that we worship, who refers to himself as a jealous God. However, our concept of idols can sometimes become confused because hardly ever, at least in my personal experience, do we see our neighbors or we ourselves construct statues in our backyard for the purposes of worshiping them. However, idols make a lot more sense when we look at the story of the golden calf a little bit closer. In the golden calf story, the people of Israel fashion essentially another Yahweh in their own liking. The image they select is a calf. So point number one, When we intentionally take the teachings of God, the characteristics of God, and mold them into something that we are more comfortable with or something that is more supportive of our agenda, we run into a conflict with the first of these two commandments. From our history, our specific history as Christians, an example of taking teachings of God and molding them into our own image could be the Crusades. That things that were in pursuit of quote unquote God led to people or groups of people doing things that don't necessarily or did not necessarily support the whole biblical idea. In more modern times, both political parties, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party of the United States, have used phrases from the Bible or from teachings of Jesus or God to bolster up their positions. And those positions themselves may very well be good and solid positions that do support our Christian faith. However, there are probably more than one occurrences when they do not, and they take the teachings of God and mold them into something that supports their purposes. So that's number one, first way that we make idols. Number two is exchange something good for something less. We tend to use things that were meant for our benefit and turn them into gods, our idols. In the case of the golden calf, the people of Israel took a cow, a creature they were meant to rule over. That's from the Genesis account of creation, that mankind was meant to rule over the beasts that roam the field, and they fashioned it into a creature that they worship. Again, while not as clear as the Old Testament story makes it for our understanding, I have a tendency to do the same. Depending on the day, I can elevate my job, my family, the appearance of my front yard, how it appears to my neighbors, the food I eat, to a position of worship through the energy, time, effort I spend chasing those things. In the end, I'm cheated, since the greenness of my yard cannot fill the position of God, and God is cheated as he has been replaced by something as powerless as grass. N.T. Wright does a much better job than I will do describing this point in his book, The Day the Revolution Began. But the point is, we elevate those things that were meant for our enjoyment to a position of worship and displace God from his spot as the ruler of our lives. So just a couple of thoughts on how this story of the golden calf is much more relatable to us in the 21st century than sometimes we may make it out to be. So to tie up that brief detour, the context of the story, the context that we first see the phrase punishes the children is telling, in that it has to do with people not obeying or not obeying the first of God's 10 commandments. Okay, in previous classes, we pointed out that mentions of this verse in cases before and after the Exodus 34 account do provide clarification more so than Genesis 34 does. So when you read Genesis 34, you could come away with the feeling that, oh my goodness, God is willy-nilly and he just punishes generation after generation because one person messed up. And what we see both in that original account in the Ten Commandments and then in later retellings of the story is that there is some clarification provided that God does not just punish willy-nilly, but he punishes those for the third and fourth generation who hate him. And he shows love to 1,000 generations for those who love him. So clarifying it is the disposition of the person that results in this either punishment or blessing from God. Secondly, the phrase 3 to 4, specifically in relation to punishing the children, I think there's two things happening there. One, there's a balance, and we talked about this before. 3 and 4 is much smaller than thousands. So there's this balance of God wanting to show love several times greater than what he wants to punish. And then number two, the phrase third and 4 or 3 to 4 is used in multiple locations in the Bible, in Proverbs and in Amos, and it points out a list of as many as needed. So it's a turn of phrase that could be used to mean as long as this will go for. So the number is not absolute, but it does imply for whatever duration is needed, the punishment will happen. In relation to as many as are required, thinking back to the Genesis story, and we talked about this in a previous class, we related the Genesis story of each generation in Genesis becoming worse than the previous generation. So you had Adam and Eve first, and then Cain, and then Cain's descendants progressively get worse and worse. And so you have this idea of generations becoming worse over time. We relate it to a drumbeat in the previous class. And then we have this idea that each of those generations showed their hate for God for building idols, quote unquote idols, to replace him. And so God's punishment goes for as long as needed as the people do not love him. And there's the example, of the drumbeat and the generations in Genesis. So a couple of thoughts to wrap up that. First of all, the punishment is tied to the disposition of the individual or the person. So the punishment, again, is not willy-nilly and shouldn't be thought of God just handing out calamity for people based on the decisions their great-grandfather made. And then secondly, the disposition of a parent is easily transferred to the next generation. So what I mean by that, the stories we saw in Genesis of people becoming worse and worse, my responsibility as a parent is hopefully to make good decisions, so my children will in turn make good decisions. That's not a guarantee. But what we do know is that if I as a parent make poor decisions, my children are probably more likely to make poor decisions in their future for their lives. Okay, the next place we'll stop on our tour investigating this specific phrase is in Ezekiel 18. This specific idea of punishing the generations comes up in the story of Ezekiel. And it appears that this phrase, the parents eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge, had become a popular phrase in the culture of the time. It's actually, this phrase is repeated specifically in Jeremiah, and then the ideal of this is presented in other locations in the Bible as well. And the idea behind this phrase, the parents eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge, is that when you eat a sour grape or you drink sour juice, you have this feeling of your teeth becoming starchy, or you have this cringing feeling. And what we're saying here is that the people were saying, our parents ate the sour grapes, but we're the ones that have this poor aftertaste in our mouth. So this idea of the generation after, or the generations after, being punished for the decisions of their parents. And so what happens here is and I think Paul McQueen mentioned this in the class previously, this specific verse. We have this quote from God: "What do you people mean by quoting this proverb about the land of Israel? The parents eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, you will no longer quote this proverb in Israel. For everyone belongs to me, the parent as well as the child, both alike belong to me. The one who sins is the one who will die." And so a couple of thoughts here. First of all is that phrase at the bottom, the one who sins is the one who will die. In multiple locations, and actually a trend throughout the Bible, is this idea of sin leading to death. It's built out in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, is that the wages of sin are death, is brought up in the New Testament. And you think about when Adam and Eve are banished from the garden, the promise made by God is that if you break eating from these trees, you will surely die. So this idea of being departed from God or separating yourself from God does lead to death. Now back to the story itself. In this specific case, it seems like the people who are stuck in exile or who are suffering what they say is a punishment of their ancestors are claiming that they themselves have done nothing wrong and they shouldn't be suffering for these things. And so God kind of takes a spin on this verse different than at least we started approaching it earlier, is that he's working backwards. And he's saying people are claiming we have done nothing wrong, but we're seeing punishment. And God is telling them a story that counters that. And so God lays out his case, and he says, if a righteous man gives birth to an unrighteous son, the righteous man, the righteous father, he will live, but the unrighteous son, he will die. And then he says, if that unrighteous man, if he has a righteous son, just the opposite, or just the same trend will play through. The unrighteous father, he will die, and the righteous son will, I should say the righteous son will live. The righteous son will not die. I apologize again for the typo. So you have this idea built out, and God concludes, therefore, you Israelites, I will judge each of you according to your own ways, declares the sovereign Lord. Or put a different way, each person is responsible for their own actions. If we jump into the New Testament, this phrase, or at least this idea, seems to still be hanging around in the New Testament. And so in John 9, as Jesus is walking with his disciples, they find a man who is blind. And his disciples ask him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So you have the same idea that the consequences that I experience are directly related to the decisions of my ancestors. And Jesus does not seem to have the same point of view. He clearly states that it's neither this man nor his parents who have sinned. Jesus actually clarifies the reasons this happened is for God's glory to be shown to them that day. But it's not related to the sins of someone's ancestors. So what this brings us to is that we are responsible for our own actions according to the judgment of God. What it also leads us to see, or not necessarily dismiss, is that our decisions today still bear consequences. That is true in the stories that we saw earlier in Genesis. The decisions of each individual or each family unit do bear consequences, and sometimes those consequences can last for generations, both on the positive side and the negative side. In our personal experience, families or individuals in a family who are more prone to drug or alcohol abuse will have a much higher tendency to bear children who share that same struggle in life. On the counter, families who do a good job teaching their children about money practices and balancing bank accounts, et cetera, their kids are much more likely to be successful in the eyes of business than their peers because of the teachings of their parents. However, these two things also are balanced out with the story of Job. That just because we make good choices or just because we make bad choices does not necessarily mean that we will always have good consequences or always have bad consequences. That's the balance that Job provides on the stories of Proverbs, where Proverbs says, do this and this will happen. The experience of Job is do this and this will not necessarily always happen. Okay, so that's just some thoughts on the phrase itself, punishes the children. Again, the concluding thoughts there is that God does not punish generation after generation. He judges each individual based on the decisions that individual has made. However, for us to take home with us is that the choices we make do make it perhaps easier or harder for those around us to make the right decisions in their own individual lives. So the next question we ask ourselves in that list was, when does God get angry? And last week, I threw out a trivia question, and I'm going to answer it here in a second to the group. When was the first time God gets angry? So I'll give you the answer here in a second, and then when we go off mute, you can tell me if you are right or wrong in that. But before we answer that question, we need to beat around the bush a little bit here and talk about our favorite idiom. And so I have on the screen here Amelia Bedelia, who those of you who at some point read children's stories are probably very familiar with Amelia Bedelia. Amelia Bedelia takes idioms and translates them literally to the detriment of the people who hire her oftentimes. However, idioms are just phrases that if you were removed from our culture, you would probably have no idea what we were talking about. So, for example, beat around the bush, break a leg, piece of cake, knock on wood, etc., etc. 500 years from now, people will look back and think, what were they trying to communicate with those phrases? So I'm not just bringing this up for fun. In the account of Exodus 34, the phrase slow to anger is itself an Hebrew idiom or turn of phrase. If you look at the King James Version, that same phrase is translated, instead of slow to anger, it's translated long suffering, which maybe gets closer to this idea of the actual meaning. But the makeup of that phrase, long suffering or slow to anger, is actually two Hebrew words. The first of those two is long, and the second is nostrils or nose. And so literally, that instead of being slow to anger, it translates long nose or long nostrils in the Hebrew text. And so what in the world does it mean to have a long nose? Well, if you go back to the story, of Joseph, where Joseph is working underneath Pharaoh and his brothers come to him after Joseph plants a cup in one of the brothers' satchels on the way home. Judah comes back and is pleading in front of Joseph, and he says, "Please, my Lord, let your servant speak a word in the ears of my Lord, and let not your anger burn against your servant, for you are like Pharaoh himself." And again, we have this phrase, anger burn, and again, literally, it's translated nose or nostrils burn. And so this idea we're building out is that, think about when you get very angry, perhaps. My nose doesn't get red, but my face will get red when I get angry. And so literally what the text reads in Exodus 34, 5-7 is, it takes a long time for God to have a hot nose, or it takes a long time for God's face to get hot, which I can say I'm thankful for. And I can say that the story of the golden calf reinforces that idea, that it takes a long time for God to have this hot nose. If you think back to the story in Exodus 34, in Exodus with the golden calf, God, before he acts on his anger, he talks with Moses and he walks through his ideas and he listens to Moses, and there's dialogue back and forth. So his anger has not taken control of him completely to the point that he can't hear the cries of the people that call him Father. All right, so knowing that, the first time that phrase, hot nose, appears when it describes God is in the story of Moses refusing or being hesitant to be God's instrument in front of Pharaoh. And what we're told is that God was angry with Moses and said, "Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he certainly can speak. And also, he is coming out to meet you. And when he sees you, he will rejoice in his heart." So the first time God gets angry in the biblical account is when Moses, for whatever reason, does not trust in God to deliver him in this specific position of standing in front of Pharaoh. What's interesting, I think, is up until that point in the story, there's a handful of accounts in the Bible that you would think God may have been angry in. And we're just reading what the text gives us. So whether or not God was angry during these accounts, I don't know. But I can tell you in the flood story, the phrase is not God is angry, it's God is hurt, or he is saddened or grieved by the way the people have turned against him. In the story of Babel, the biblical text does not express any emotion of God, but he is interested to go and see what is happening down on earth. And in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, God hears the outcry coming from Sodom. And this idea we talked about is similar, can be related to compassion, in that when God hears the outcry, he acts in compassion to help those in need. And so, again, 3 stories in the biblical text that you may think God was angry in, but in fact, according to the text, he was not. All right, so some thoughts to wrap us up here today. unfortunately don't have time to build out all the times when God gets angry in this class. But just to conclude, the punishment that we talked about the first this class is tied to our personal disposition. And though our personal disposition is our responsibility, the people around us do have great influence on what our disposition is. We are responsible for our own actions, which is a good American phrase to have. Being responsible for the things that you do, that's your responsibility. And it seems to be that's the way that God views it as well. Consequences do follow from generations to generations, however. So while God is not maybe the instrument behind those consequences, there are natural things that flow from the choices that we make. And finally, God's anger does not always precede action. So what do I mean by that? Is that God, in the case of Babel, in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, and in the case of the flood, does not express anger, but did act against those things. And then God's anger does not always lead to action. So in the story of Moses not being willing to take his role in front of Pharaoh, God does not act out violently towards him because he is angry. And in fact, offers a solution that Moses is willing to accept after he is angry. So this class, we wrapped up the punishes the children and their children phrase. We at least started digging into when does God get angry and what makes him angry. And we'll continue that in the next class. And then in the next class as well, we'll dig deeper into this idea of what does God do when he is angry. So unlike previous classes, I don't know if there is an actionable charge to us. The compassion class and the graciousness class gave us an actionable charge to be different in the way we live this week. I don't know if that's the same case here about God. However, I think we can leave here being thankful that we all know that we've made poor decisions in our lives and sometimes make them on a daily basis. And I am thankful that the God that we serve does not get a hot nose very quickly, but his anger is more than balanced by his compassion and his graciousness.